Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Let me just begin with, first of all, hope you all had a pleasant and healthy and happy holiday. And we're back to work. And so I hope that you can get back into the swing of things with what we're doing. And reminder, first of all, that you do have an assignment that is coming due. This is, now, if you take a look here, we've done the clause-based analysis, and that is due on February the 20th. Oh, these dates are wrong. Okay, yeah, they're right. Okay. The 10th was the clause-based analysis, and the 24th, the theme analysis, is what is coming up. Now, what I had said to you when I made the announcement about for this week, I said that I would talk about the clause-based analysis, which you all have seen. And thank you, by the way, for some of the corrections that needed to be made in terms of the bracketing and numbering of clauses. So I think it's should be all right now. But let's. I thought we could go through that first of all and talk about that today, just to sort of clarify some of the points that, especially when it comes to what would be considered a rank-shifted clause. And so let's just go through this text and go through the clause-based analysis. Okay, so the first sentence. And again, I would appreciate you using the notation as I'm using here. That is the angle brackets to indicate the clause, and which the numbering would correspond to the sentence, and the letters would indicate the subclauses. When I'm up here on stage, so that would be the dependent clause. It is 1A. In fact, the main clause would be 1B. They call me Brandon. That one was quite straightforward. And again, it's the same occurs in the next sentence. When I'm with my homies, the main clause then 2B, they call me B. So he basically uses the same structure in these first two sentences. Continues 3, and again it's similar, but a bit of expansion here. He begins again, and when I'm with the ladies. So again, that's the when clause, the dependent clause. 3B, let's just say, all right, so 3B would be introducing a projection that's to follow, which is to follow from the verb say, the verbal process. Now, I just put in parentheses that here to show you that it really just say that they call me taken. So it is a that clause, a projected clause, 3C. 3D, because I'm already happily spoken for. So those would be 4 subclauses within that sentence. So far, nothing really, I think, that would be difficult to notice. 4, sentence 4. But when I'm back at home, 4B, my mama, she call me Pookie. All right, so again, here we have sort of a very colloquial sounding 4B, my mama, she. So it's an appositive. You're putting two nouns, basically, a noun and the pronoun reference, side by side, repeating. All right, so my mama, she call me Pookie. So what we've seen so far, the first 4 sentences, very similar structure. When, this or that, and then the main clause or subsequent clauses follow. Sentence 5, and no, I'm not afraid to admit it, 5B. 5C, my mother calls me Pookie like the most inopportune times. All right. Again, no rank shifting here. It's just basically a dependent clause to admit it, and then my mother would be, my mother calls me. again, it would be like admit it that my, so in fact, the what is 5C is almost like a that clause, again, like a projection from the verb to admit. Okay, 6. For instance, today on my way home here to America's Got Talent, my mom screamed out the front door. All right, so it's long, but that doesn't detract. There's only really the one verb here, screamed. 6B, and then this would be a direct quotation. So direct speech. Make sure, and then I would take make sure to be, again, another clause. Again, make sure what? That you call me, and then we have the dependent when clause that follows when you get there. Again, so far, it's all been one clause after the other, which we identified on the basis of the verbs, all right? The main verb that is there. 7, and like I get, and here I took like I get is like I understand. And then again, what do you understand? 7B, why my mother says it out of courtesy. 8, but to be real, again, you do have a verb here, to be real, non-finite verb, to be real. I don't understand, and then understand, again, a mental process projecting 8C, why my mom's so concerned with my safety. 9, praying for me, a non-finite clause, again, an ing verb, as I leave the house on a daily. 10, we get into a bit more complicated, because here we get clauses that are acting as a kind of post-modification. They're not, you'll notice that when we have like a projection, we have a mental process or a verbal process that has a that clause that follows. Now that's a projected that clause. It's different than, for example, what we'll see here, which are essentially relative clauses. And these relative clauses act as a kind of post-modification of the noun that they follow. And so what we're saying is that then these clauses are sort of subsumed under that main noun. And that main noun, as in young man, a young man who has faith in Jesus. All right, so that subclause, that rank-shifted clause, it's embedded, it's part of the noun phrase, a young man. So we'll bracket it off. The same way, again, way is a noun. Notice here is it when you identify there's a noun followed by a clause, a relative clause, the same way that stars have faith, that space, now you might say have faith. Now you could have argued this with me in the fact of C and D. Let me read it. 10C, the stars have faith, the space will protect them from this galactic bully. Now, before going on, let me deal with this. Now here I've taken have faith, that. What do I sort of am inferring from it that have faith is like a kind of process, but obviously it's not. It is the process to have and the noun faith. So in fact, you could argue and say that 10D is also rank shifted, but I'm taking it more like to have faith in something, to believe something, to have faith as another way of saying to believe. And in that sense, I'm taking it as a kind of process to have faith. So in that sense, I'm taking it as a process which projects to believe that space will protect them from this galactic bully. In a way, it's a kind of almost, well, it is a sort of And this is one of the things that Halliday points out, that we have different ways of sort of construing things, sort of saying things. And we can say verbs like believe, trust. But another way to say that is to have faith, to believe. Now, are we using it as a kind of process, or are we using it as the verb to have plus the noun faith? It's arguable here, all right? It's arguable because in a way, I'm treating it as the verb to have faith, to believe, all right? Continuing on, is that clear? Any questions so far? Okay, I'll continue then. And by the way, if you do want to communicate with me, I'm hopeful that I can hear you on the speaker, and I probably better not to use during the lecture using the chat, because it's on computer to my side here, and I'm normally not looking at that, and so I could miss it if it's during the lecture. If it's during the lecture, feel free to speak up. All right, feel free to just call out my name and then ask your question. All right. All right, so I'm carrying on, and then this galactic bully, which, now I've added the which there. Yes, I'm filling it in there. I'm saying that it's a relative clause, and the which was ellipted. A galactic bully, which we call gravity. And then there's another rank shifted clause, 10F, which adds some more information about this galactic bully. Another relative clause, who longs to turn their stardust splendid spectacle for passerbyers to watch in awe of its death. Okay, so I'm taking it again as for is like a conjunction for passerbyers to watch in awe of its death. And basically F is another relative clause. And so it does get complicated, because really this whole part here, we have two sort of rank shifted clauses modifying bully, the second of which expands into several clauses, 10F, G, H. 10C, we're saying that that's an embedded clause to modify way, all right? So a bit complicated, 10, strikingly, all right? That's something that you should be paying attention to. You'll notice that it stands out, all right, by virtue of the sort of complexity that's how it's put together. Contrast that with, as we continue, 11. So yes, I never really understand the issue. One simple clause. The contrast couldn't be greater, right? So complex, 10, and 11 then, so that's it, one clause. 12, again, it's not so simple. And then I went on Facebook and I realized a mental process projected that my mama loved me the same way. How again? That every mother loved their son. Again, modifying way. So again, a kind of post-modification. 13, simple again. Fearfully, because normally death don't really bother me. 14, I mean what? I mean as a kind of, again, a kind of sort of projecting. I mean that I'm from the south side Stockton. 15, some complexity in the sense we again have some rank shifting, again as the sort of the object of a preposition. I'm all too familiar with, and then what follows is sort of a nominalization that is the object of that preposition. 15b, how some family reunions only ever take place on graveyard grass, and how a hole can be safe haven for a soul in this mortal game of hide and go seek. All right, so again, we have some post-modification here. Again, look to see if a clause is being preceded by a preposition, like of or with. For is tricky because for can be both a conjunction and a preposition, all right? 16, again, it lists several people, but it's again a simple clause. 17, and as I stared at that screen, dependent clause, not unlike a when clause, as, I couldn't help but think I was looking at a mirror image of myself. Again, we have an embedding myself who was being choked out for merely existing. Here again, I would take the for in order to merely existing, or for daring to be more than 3/5 of. Then what follows the of, again, a nominalization as the object of the preposition. Of what them folk thought them to be, or maybe it was simply due to their hue. All right, so again, it's a bit complicated. I should have probably colored the bracketing, but just to sort of illustrate where it begins and so forth. I take it, though, since there were no questions about it, that this probably was all right and understood. 18 gets, again, way more complicated. And again, I do want you to be thinking about this. And you'll notice it especially when you go on and you do the other kinds of analysis. Especially this would be the kind of logical analysis that we will be doing. And again, we notice the great amount of complexity, the great amount of dependent clauses, layers of them, so that in 18, and I needed to use the coloring of the brackets to make sure I got it right, all right? In that moment, I better understand, mental process, projecting. My black mother's greatest fear was, now the verb to be, what follows it again is like the noun. What was my black mother's greatest fear? The was, the verb to be here, sort of identifying what was that fear. Now, it begins here, and you can see the bracket ends. And so within this rank-shifted clause, we're going to have, again, several more layers, all right? We have one right there on the surface, every time that I leave home. Continuing, 18C, on the other side of my phone will no longer be her son, would be America's next most popular hashtag. Again, we have then which is accompanied by video of, and then the of, again, has a nominalization, which is the object of that preposition, which itself consists of several clauses. So you have to say to yourself then, when do you notice this kind of deep embedding? Is there a reason for it? Is there something that's being drawn out here? And we noticed it here in 18. We noticed it in I believe it was 10 just a moment ago. 19. So yes, my mother's greatest fear is that I won't return home breathing, blood pulsing through these veins enough to still be her Pookie. And my mama warned me. And then again, we have direct speech incorporated here. Son continues on. Again, nothing is very special here in terms of how it continues. The whole thing is what the mother said. It's the direct speech, but again, comprised in several clauses. And then 20, so dear mom, I promise you this, I will do everything in my power to make it back home to you. 21, again, it's rather straightforward, one clause after the other. No rank shifting here. All right, so I hope that I was quite pleased with what I saw in terms of your analyses. It was quite good. Some of you had a better handle on in terms of rank shifting and embedding. For some of you, that was more of an issue, and I hope that in looking at this model and after the, the discussion just now, I hope it helps you to have a better idea how we identify what is a rank shifted clause.
Dr. Webster,
Yes.
can we go back to 19?
Sorry?
Can we go back to 19?
19.
Yes, the last slide.
Yes.
Yes, and to still be Herpuki, is this a rank shift here? And if so, why?
Which one are we?
19E.
19E. All right.
Why is this a rank shift?
I took it to be because the veins enough, and I took it to be enough as being sort of post-modifying enough, and that's why I considered it to be rank shifted. Blood pulsing through these veins enough, so basically a modifier of enough to still be Herpuki.
So
That's my
enough
reasoning.
is a post modifier here.
Yes.
I noticed that we have mentioned a couple of words like post-modification, embedded, relative, rank shift, normalization. Could you help to clarify the relationship between all these terminologies a little bit?
Sure. Okay. Let's say that in terms of what I'm referring to as embedding is another way for saying rank shifted. All right. So I do not include embedding dependent clauses. Some people, when they refer to embedding, they're referring to also the use of dependent clauses. What I would take to be rank shifted would be those clauses that are either the object of a preposition or post-modifying a noun. And that would be, so the post-modification is a kind of rank shifting. Now, there is a rank shifting that is also a kind of nominalization. Now that would be where, for example, you have a nominalized clause as the grammatical subject.
I got it.
Okay.
Okay, so basically there are some synonyms here.
Yeah, in the sense that what I'm taking to be a, and this there may be, thank you for asking the question. It's a good question because some people, if you look up in some grammars, the dependent clauses would also be talked about as being embedded. That's not the meaning here. What I'm taking as embedded would be rank shifted clauses. Rank shifted clauses can include the kind of where it is a post modification. That's one type. So it's not really synonyms because nominalizations that are act as the grammatical subject of a sentence, of a clause, that would be what we would take to be a nominalization, which is rank shifted, but it's not a kind of what should I say? It's not a post modification.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if we have any examples here.
So rank shift includes, for example, post-modification, normalization.
Okay, so we have, I think we did have an example here where it was followed by the verb. It was an embedded clause following the verb to be. I have to go back to look through these to see. I want to give you as an example.
It's okay. I think that was quite clear.
No, I appreciate you, but I also those are very good questions, but I do want to make that clear. And there was one example here where it was following the verb to be. Uh, Let me just take a look for a moment.
C 17H.
18. 18C, you know, that part here. Greatest fear was the verb to be. And then what follows is really an extended nominalization, which includes several kinds of post modification. All right. So there it can be sort of a difference. When you say my black mother's greatest fear was, well, now what follows within sort of the blue brackets here from 18C then to the end of the sentence, that all is what we would call a nominalization. The nominalization acting as, in this case, the complement of the verb to be. Okay? Now it incorporates this sort of very complex nominalization, incorporates several examples of post modification, 18D, for example, 18F, and so on. And we also have a kind of a nominalization, which is the object of the preposition of, and that is what you see in 18G. So in other words, you do sort of need to make a distinction between what is a complex nominalization, which would be the object, it would be some kind of grammatical entity where it is the object of a preposition, or it could be the complement, or it could be the grammatical subject. All right? Distinguish that from embedded clauses, which are relative clauses, typically relative clauses that are a kind of post modifier of some noun that is its head. Okay?
Yes, I think the picture is more clear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Any other questions before we go on?
Professor Webster?
Yes?
Can you explain 21B?
21. 21.
B?
B?
B for boy?
B for boy. We do have a verb, no, just no. It would be, this is a kind of an imperative, isn't it? 21B, just no. In other words, it doesn't have a grammatical subject and it doesn't have a finite verb. Just know, it's an imperative. So just know, and it's a mental process. What do you know? 21C. You was the very last thing on my mind. Am I missing something which you're wondering about?
Yeah, I was wondering about the grammatical subject.
Okay, I mean, in this case, just know, just is basically simply know something. It sort of modifies know, is sort of an adverb, which is modifying know, but know here is 21B is an imperative. Just know, all right? You're just like, open the door, just open the door, just close the window, just know. And so it's basically it isn't a declarative, interrogative, it's an imperative. Is that clear?
Thank you.
All right. Okay, any other questions? I appreciate the questions because it often brings to the surface some doubts that might be lingering there. If not, I won't press you on that. Feel free to maybe send me a chat or a question later if it comes to mind. All right, so let's go on from here. Hopefully we've got the clause structure clear. That's the first step. And next you will be doing the theme analysis. And I hope you've already started working on that. This is due very soon. It's on the 24th, so it's due this week. I hope that what you are doing is something similar, and I'm just going to go through the first 3 sentences. All right, so let me just sort of, I just am coloring here. Green is for the textual themes. Sort of a blue here is sort of a bluish purple, it looks like, is the ideational themes. And in the case of 3B, it's interesting. There again, let's just say, there let's is the first person imperative. All right, let's just say. So it's a let us, first person plural imperative. Let's just say. So the let's here I'm taking to be sort of interpersonal. But at the same time, it's also, I mean, that's the idea. And you could say then, well, what would be the ideational theme? Well, it's a verb, let us. So in a way, it is serving both purposes. I would take it, though, ideationally, identifying clearly that it's an imperative here. All right, so if I go back here, let me just go through 1A, when textual theme, I'm up here on stage. 1B, they call me. Can I give you advice again? I remind you, first thing you look for is the experiential theme. What is the experiential theme? It's the process, participant, the circumstance. I is the experiential theme. Before it comes the textual theme, when. 1B, they is the experiential theme. 2, when, again, repeating the same structure here in as we just see in 1. 3, again, repeating, and when, the two together, because the and is really sort of acting as a kind of conjunction to join the whole sentence 3 with what preceded it, and then the when is identifying that sort of relationship between 3A and 3B. And so we have sort of a textual theme combination here. 1 is expressing the relation between 3 and what preceded it. When is expressing the relationship between 3A and 3B. 3B I've already mentioned here. They call me. They is the ideational theme, experiential theme. Now again, you might notice I'm using two words sort of together, right? Ideational and experiential. It's because the ideational theme, ideational metafunction, includes the experiential, also includes the logical. So when I say it is the ideational theme, I'm really referring specifically to the fact that it is the experiential theme. All right, so with that, I just wanted to do 3 examples, and please enter it into the Excel spreadsheet like you see here, and this is what you should be sending to me, all right? This is what you should be uploading on the 24th. Whereas the first assignment is dealing with the clause structure, I asked you to do it as a Word document. Please just send me your Excel file here, all right, that you got, and submit it, filling out the information that's the textual theme, the interpersonal, the topical, and the displaced. Now, you'll notice that let me show you how I did the let's. I identified let's as both the interpersonal and let as the process, us as sort of the displaced theme. Now that's how I analyzed it, so that it was both in a way, the ideational and the interpersonal. All right. All right, so please complete that part of your assignment. What you will be doing next is the transitivity analysis. This will be due in week 8. All right, this will be due on the 10th of March. So there's still time before we get to that. And I'm not going to go through it with you today. I'm not going to go through I'll do this next week, my analysis of the puff text, all right? And you have the slide here, and I will be going through this, though, in more detail, explaining to you what I want you to be doing with the transitivity analysis. I didn't want to go through it today with you because you're doing the theme analysis. I want you to complete that and not put too much burden on you, all right? So next week, I'll talk about the analysis of that golden buzzer puff text, we're referring to it, and show you what I want you to be doing. All right, so in any case, you will see the slides here. And what I would suggest, if you have time to do so before lecture next time, you might go through these slides, these 3 slides here, look at my analysis, and be prepared to ask questions next time as I go through it. Okay? All right, well, there's another thing I want to talk with you about, and that is we are coming up to week 8, and we're time to have a kind of in-class exercise. I'm calling it kind of a midterm test, all right? And this counts 10% of the overall weighting. So I want to just mention something about that today. What I'm going to give you here are some, for example, it will be like an essay kind of test. And this will be in week 8 on the 8th of March. And what I will do is I will give you 3 questions, not these 3 questions, okay? These questions are what I have used in the past. And they will give you a very good idea. If you can basically answer these questions, then you're well on your way to being able to handle the midterm test. All right, so these are underscore sample questions. These are not the same 3 questions that I will give you for the midterm test. All right, so that'll be in 2 weeks' time. Now, what I want to do with you is next week, I'm going to go through with you how to answer these 3 questions that I'm giving you here. I'm going to go through what we've covered in the previous lectures and how that information would be used to sort of address these 3 questions. And I think that'll be a helpful review to be able to identify sort of the main areas where I want you to be familiar. All right, so let me just quickly go through question 1. If we distinguish process types just on the basis of differences in meaning, one could argue that every verb is semantically different from every other. Halliday argues that the process types, material, mental, behavioral, existential, relational, verbal, should instead be distinguished on the basis of grammar. Explain how Halliday distinguishes the various process types on the basis of grammar. What difficulties may arise in trying to apply Halliday's approach to distinguishing the various process types? And give examples to support your answer. So obviously that question was dealing with transitivity structure. The second question, theoretical approach pioneered by M.A.K. Halliday is called systemic functional linguistics. Why systemic? Why functional? Explain how these 2 terms serve to distinguish Halliday's approach to the study of language as compared with more formal approaches such as been put forward by Noam Chomsky. And question 3, Ruqayya Hassan believes that verbal art, so here there may be a question related to verbal art, believes that verbal art has a deeper meaning and that this deeper meaning represents a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. She explains how this deeper meaning is conveyed through a process which she calls symbolic articulation. Using an example of verbal art discussed in class, whether a poem or a drama, explain how the poet or dramatist uses symbolic articulation to convey their hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. What you would do in the midterm test is choose one of 3 questions to answer. And the midterm test is completely open book. You will be doing it, I assume, online. There will be no restrictions in terms of material that you can have available in front of you, printed material, electronic material, no restrictions, let me put it that way. So it's completely open book. You should be thinking about already the kinds of topics that we've covered in the lectures up until now. We have talked about verbal art. We have talked about transitivity. We have talked about the theory. So be thinking about that. We'll talk more about how I would answer these questions and how I would take what I've been covering in lecture and address these questions next time. All right, so again, be going back over what we've covered. Questions, feel free to ask. And this should not be difficult, but it will sort of be determined on the basis of how well you answer the question. All right. So are there any questions before I go further, before I start into today's topic? Any questions? Okay, good. I hope that is all very clear. And okay, good. Let's proceed. So there's 2 things that you have to be keeping in mind for week 8. The 8th of March, normal class time, during the normal class time. And I will give you the full period to do so. It's 7 o'clock. You will get the questions, and by 10 o'clock, you need to submit. All right? It'd be similar to like how one would conduct an exam. All right? Except no need for additional cameras or anything like that. It is open book, so it must be, though, your own work. In other words, should not be something which you work with someone else. And if there was a kind of plagiarizing where there was sort of copying of the same paper, that would be definitely not right. All right, that would be definitely wrong. So I think, but otherwise you can be going through your material and have your material ready and useful to you when you do the test. All right, so I hope we're clear on what is expected going forward. All right, I'm nearly time to have a break, but I think it's a bit still too soon to have a break. It's about almost 7:45. So let me just begin. Review a bit what we covered before as the lead in to what we'll be talking about in this lecture. First thing, Professor Ruqayyah Hassan talks about there being 2 orders of meaning. What is the first order? The first order is basically what the language expresses. It's what's there on the surface. It is the relationship between meaning and grammar and phonology. But she's saying that we can use that language to articulate symbols, metaphors. And again, we're using symbol and metaphor almost interchangeably. So symbolic articulation, that's the name that she gives it. And she's saying symbolic articulation, that is how the meanings of language, the first order of meanings, are turned into signs having a deeper meaning. What is symbolic articulation? She describes it as foregrounding. What does foregrounding mean? How does foregrounding articulate a symbol? How does it produce metaphor? I quote Professor David Butt, who says this: mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice. In other words, mobilizing, using the way that we usually use language and forming it into a non-habitual, not expected, not usual, not typical consistency, pattern, forming patterns. The patterns themselves become the background. It becomes what will enable then the poet to repattern on that patterning to foreground what is their intended meaning, which is the theme. So there's a purpose here. It's not purely aesthetic. There's a purpose. What she's saying is that the purpose then of verbal art is to communicate a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man, what she calls theme. Obviously, not the Halliday notion of theme that you've been doing the analysis of, but theme in the literary sense, because originally she's coming from a literature background, so she's referring to it as theme. So what is the theme? The theme is a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. Now, Halliday doesn't, what he's saying is that there's a better way to talk about it. And he relies on Mukarovsky's term. Mukarovsky comes from the Prague School of Linguistics. Prague School of Linguistics is famous in terms of text linguistics, in terms of especially looking at what some people call stylistics. Mukarovsky's term, de-automatization. Halliday prefers that. He prefers this term, de-automatization, to foregrounding. Why? Halliday explains, since what is in question, since the issue is not simply prominence and not simply what stands out, but rather the partial freeing of the lower level systems from the control of the semantics so that they become domains of choice in their own right. What are these lower level systems that are freed from the control of the semantics? Basically, what it is doing is you create a pattern. That pattern is an automatization. You can call it foregrounding when you then create a repatterning which goes against that automatization. Go back to this. To de-automatize means to try to interpret the grammar in terms that go beyond its direct realizational function. It means to identify the metaphor, the other meaning, the alternative meaning. Now, yes, they're close, but there's something different here. There is, in other words, foregrounding is a kind of de-automatization, but de-automatization is a larger term. It is a more general term. So that when we talked about, for example, grammatical metaphor, that is also a kind of de-automatization. A de-automatization that we see in the language of science. Now remember, Halliday is coming at this from the point of view, he's interested in the language of science. Hassan is interested from the standpoint of verbal art. What Halliday is trying to get at is that it's all really about creating metaphors. And what is a metaphor? It is to de-automatize. For the poet, it's creating a pattern with a purpose to break the pattern. That's foregrounding. To create something which is an automatization against which to de-automatize. So the question, remember, came back, how do we determine whether, when we are looking at an example of verbal art, how do we determine that it is indeed art and not accident? How do we determine that it was the intention to create a pattern and foreground against that pattern? Or is it just the case where we've identified something that occurs very often? It has a consistency to it, but it is not necessarily part of the craft. It doesn't contribute to the theme, the hypothesis. What we said is that you must, in terms of when we're looking at verbal art, look at both contrast and consistency. Contrast and consistency. What's consistency? Again, Professor David Butt talks about there being a kind of semantic drift. The manner in which an ensemble of features take the reader toward the same general kind of meaning. In other words, there's several things going on at the same time. There's several kinds of contrasts that are co-occurring. And they occur at some specific point, the location in the organization of the text. So there is a consistency across various features that are co-occurring in a particular location. What is the result is a literary artifact is an extended metaphor. The poem itself, how it is structured, becomes the extended metaphor. So today, what we're going to look at is some more of the verbal art of Professor Edwin Tumble. Going to be looking at my analysis of his poetry. I already talked to you about one of the poems. That was Gods Can Die, if you remember. Remember this, that the poet himself comes at it from an interest in language. He is saying that he says, I'm looking at language as part of my life. I'm trying to make my poems, putting language together. Language is the focus. For the poet, language is the resource that is the basis of their craft. Just like the paints are for the painter. But it's not just words themselves, all right? It's more than it's the combination of these words together. Or as, again, Professor Edwin Tumble says, the chiseling of language, the rearranging of language, the sound, the rhythm, the tautness, the layering. The rearranging of language, the sound, the rhythm, the tautness, tight, the layering. As I mentioned, and I'm going to, before we take the break, I just want to say a few words to remind you. We looked at Gods Can Die. I'm not going to go through a long time here to explain it. You already discussed it, and you have that analysis. And you remember that when he was talking about this poem, he explained that the term gods he uses to refer to our humanistic impulses, what makes us human, the goodness in man. Gods can die. There is goodness in man, and there is evil in man. And so he says, I believe that ultimately man makes and unmakes his destiny depending on which side of him prevails. Good, evil, which side of him prevails. And so for his poem then, there was a certain duality. That became the text personality. I like that, how Halliday uses that metaphor to talk about a text. A text has personality, and that personality is reflecting, in this case, the poet's feelings about his friend's personality. He judged his friend's personality to be two-faced, hypocritical, and he's frustrated, and he has disdain for what power has done to their relationship. And so what he does is he foregrounds elements that show something that disturbs that sort of balanced state. So as you go through the poem, there's so much duality, pairs and comparing things. There's so much symmetry. In grammatical terms, so much parataxis. So that when the poet wants to show his frustration, he does away with that parataxis. He does away with that balance. Instead, he inserts hypotaxis, an imbalance, asymmetry. It is specifically to express that hypothesis about his view of what happens when one gets powerful. Power corrupts. And that was his hypothesis, and that was his poem. And the poem, you see, was specifically written in a way. Now, you could just read that poem, just the words on the surface, but that's not what's really going on. And that's what we want to discover. So when we approach the verbal art, what we're doing is we're trying to discover what is that symbolic articulation that's taking place. What is that de-automatization? What is the automatic? What's the pattern that the poet creates, that background against which to de-automatize, against which to foreground? It's now about 8 o'clock, and now it's time for a break. And we'll take a break now, and can you come back at 10 after the hour, all right, 8:10. And now I will pick up where we left off last week and look at Tumbu's David. Okay, so let's take a break. Okay, let me try to explain this concept of deautomatization. Uh, and I hope that I can give you a feel for why Halliday found it to be a better term. What can be captured that could not be captured from foregrounding? And how does it relate to Halliday's interest in the language of science, which, as you remember, he talks about that as grammatical metaphor. Remember, Halliday says this: what is at issue, what is in question, is not simply prominence. It's not simply foregrounding. Yes, foregrounding is a kind of deautomatization. I said, though, that deautomatization is a more general concept. It's a larger concept. As he says, to try to interpret the grammar in terms that go beyond its direct realizational function. It means, for Hassan, that meant a second order of meaning. For Halliday, he's referring to something else. So let me go through this concept because I'd like you to sort of have a good idea what we're talking about. Remember, we talked about what is grammatical metaphor. And remember, we said that it begins with the idea that there is sort of the congruent. What is the congruent? It is the automatic. What does it mean, congruence? It's how semantics and grammar are coupled together. Things are nouns. Qualities are adjectives. Processes are verbs, and so on. So this is the automatic. And we could sort of picture it this way, if you remember. Things are nouns. And so it goes back to what Halliday was saying about freeing the lower levels, like grammar, and if we went further down, phonology, from the semantics. Right now, semantics, things are nouns, relators are conjunctions, processes are verbs. But then we free the grammar so that it doesn't have to mean, a noun does not have to be referring to a thing, can be represented by other than a noun, essentially a process. Let me put it that way, easier. Process can be represented by other than a verb. And so the processes can be expressed as nouns. You remember our example, remind as a process plus nounness turns it into a thing, basically. But we freed it. We don't say that verbs, processes have to be represented by verbs. Instead, a process can be represented by a noun, and that noun, though, by doing so, it is going to give it a sort of metaphor. It will give it a sense of, just like a lexical metaphor here, a grammatical metaphor, it will take on the properties defined by the grammar. And so Halliday describes this idea of grammatical metaphor as becoming a means to innovate in language at the level of structure, the level of grammar, not just at the level of words. You remember in my example, in the sense I talked about, that in this, the solvent tends to be drawn through the membrane into the solution, thus diluting it, described in very congruent terms. Verbs tends to be drawn through, diluting. They are actions, they're happenings, they're described by verbs. That's what we expect. But then, which is very common in the language of science, in that register, that happening turns into a something. It's turned into a noun. And that is, if you remember at the beginning of class today, we were talking about nominalizations as the grammatical subject. Here's an ideal example of that. We've taken various elements, movement of the solvent across the membrane. We've turned that whole thing. It's a nominalization at the beginning. We've taken the verb, we've turned it into a noun so that it can now be the grammatical subject. Now, the point was that this was happening in the language of science, and it became very common in the language of science. So it's not like it's something that stands out anymore. It isn't like foregrounded. It isn't this instance of deautomatization, turning it into a grammatical metaphor, is not some kind of prominence that becomes the way people in academia, in science, and even in all aspects of governmental administration and business administration, that's the way they write. Halliday's point was that this grew out of a need, and the need was to be able to impose regularities on experience, bring the environment more within our power to control it. There was a need, and rather than the dynamic qualities of a verb, which cannot be sort of frozen, well, the way to freeze it is to turn it into a noun. You might remember this example. They educated girls. A clause turns into a nominal group, the education of girls. Women acquired the vote. A clause turns into, again, a nominal group, the acquisition of the vote by women. And so we have before, in the sort of congruent, the sort of usual way in which we talk, where verbs, processes are verbs, a very clausal way of speaking. We have multiple clauses. In the nominalization, however, we have one clause, one verb, preceded. And that preceded is taking the place of the conjunction. So there are multiple things happening here. There's a shift. The verbs and adjectives are becoming nouns. The conjunctions are becoming verbs. Those complex clauses are becoming simple clauses, and the clauses have themselves become groups. They've been pushed down a level, a rank. This shift, David Butt talks about as being a grammatical drift. Creates, as he puts it, a novel intensity in the way writers in English can construe experience. A novel intensity, a new way. And that intensity is the way in which we use language for writing. That those shifts that we notice, they have become so commonplace that is the drift. But then that's the point that we are saying about language, that these shifts become the drift. They become, these instances of language occur with such regularity that the deautomatization becomes the new automatization. The grammatical metaphor that becomes so commonplace. The instances become the system of language. You remember, go back just before I'll then leave this topic, because I hope I've made it clear. Remember, David Butt talked about it with reference to verbal art. He talked about the semantic drift. Again, it's a drift there, which is seen in the instance of a single text, a poem, or a particular piece of fiction or a drama or whatever, in which the writer is creating an automatic against which, yes, here there's foregrounding. Here there is prominence that is employed to draw your attention to the hypothesis, the theme. But what is at issue here is really the ability to metaphorize. That is what is de-automatization. You can see it in a poem, you can see it within the language of science. All right, come back to Tumbu's David. I analyzed Professor Edwin Tumbu's poem, Gods Can Die. And then he sent me this poem, and he dedicated it to me. Now, as I mentioned to you, I believe last time, it struck me then, what was the point? Why this poem? Why this story? It's a Bible story. It's an Old Testament Bible story. The Old Testament Bible story is about King David before he was a king. There was another king. His name was King Saul. In fact, King Saul was David's father-in-law. David was married to King Saul's daughter. King Saul disobeyed God, dishonored God. So God told his prophet Samuel to anoint Saul's successor. Who did God tell Samuel to anoint? David. Samuel did it. He anointed David to be Saul's successor. What did Saul want to do thereafter? Kill David. This guy's been, my son-in-law has been anointed to become king. So what does Saul do? He does his best to try to chase David down and kill him. David flees out into the desert, the wilderness. He has a band of followers with him that are helping him, and they are fleeing Saul's army. And Saul's army is chasing after David to find him and kill him. All right, so this story then. In this story, as you'll soon see, Saul's army is camped out overnight. They're asleep. Saul is with them. He is also there, and he is also asleep. David and one of his band, his name is Abishai. David and Abishai sneak into the camp. They go to where Saul is. Saul's spear is by Saul's side. Everyone is sound asleep, and David has the chance to kill Saul and end the fact that he's being chased and become king. But David doesn't want to become king like that. So David takes the spear, lets Saul know that he was there and had the chance to kill him, but did not. Gets out of the camp, safely away. Now, this particular story is repeated twice. Twice, David has the chance to kill Saul. Twice, he refuses to do so. He will become king when God makes him king. All right, now, that's what we're going to read a poem about. The poem is basically a re-narrating the Bible story. So the question in my mind is, why this story for a poem that he had dedicated to me? What was the point? What was the, in the line, there is in the poem, the line, so ensued some necessary prophecies to fill their days, some metaphors for us. What was the metaphor for me? Basically, the poet expects me to analyze it. And will I be able to discover what is that metaphor? Well, let's see. What is the poem? Let's listen to it.
David 2 for Jonathan Webster. With shepherd's stealth astutely tempered by the blunt history of his pain, David and volunteer Abishai sought and found, for the second terrible time, their king asleep. Saul's dedicated jealous anger still fermented, still heaved and proud, but David's deeply rooted faith chose to see the Lord's anointed. Not the royal discontent, the turbulent hunter of his life, who gave without intent point and precision to his hardy band, to their fugitive wanderings among hill and cave and longish and Gedian nights. Thus delivered, Saul lay fragile, exhausted, sealed in quiet, his spear neatly pushed into the ground by his bolster. Saul, the grievous, great flawed instrument, restless victim of disobedience, rampaging willfulness, who so needed music, loved courage, monumental anger, adrenaline for tribal nation, who was moved by majesty, pride, quick remorse, who remembered the quarrelsome word of Samuel, that thorn, that nuisance of a judge turned prophet. Let me smite him, I pray thee, the Lord himself will strike. And they left, taking the mighty spear, whose sharp whistle had shaved the air before, just missing him as he sat composing psalms. And the cruiser of water, life, leaving the camp, the chance to cure so simply their exile in the uncertain bitter south, they walked between trenches of enemies, divinely tranquilized. So ensued some necessary prophecies to fill their days, sparing some metaphors for us. And they get them away, and no man saw it. Darting nimbly as they climbed, held their breath, checked the drift of stars, the needling angle of the wind as it shifted across gullies, pushing patches of mist up the slopes. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts, kept from discovery certain death by the Lord, whose other hand dispensed the dew of sleep on Saul's army. They gained the distant high space of a neighboring hill, where sad David called down to Abner, Saul's bravest of the brave, "Ye are worthy to die, ye have not kept your master." Heard and spoke to Saul, and then departed.
Okay. Now, how am I going to approach this poem? I've analyzed Gods Can Die, and I noticed there that there was a sort of a background of parataxis, things in pairs. And hypotaxis was the foregrounding. So I sort of begin with that idea, looking at this poem. Okay, let's take a look at the first 4 lines. And if we analyze it, we do see a kind of symmetry here. We have 2 pairs, David and volunteer Abishai. We have 2 verbs, sought and found. And interestingly, though, we do have before the first mention David, before the first member of that pair, sort of a pre-modification. And likewise, the second verb in that pair of verbs, sought and found, has sort of a modification as well. After found, sort of indicating something where is found, all right, or when, I should say, for the second terrible time. All right, so we have sort of there's a kind of balance there. There's a kind of symmetry. There's sort of two pairs, and the first item of the first pair is sort of pre-modified, and the second item of the second pair is rather post-modified. So there does seem to be some similarity here. Let's continue. Then I noticed that there were a lot of times where it seems in the poem there are things in threes. For example, Saul's dedicated, jealous anger. Anger is pre-modified three ways. Saul's, a possessive, and then two adjectives, dedicated, jealous. What follows, Saul's dedicated, jealous anger, still fermented, still heaved, and prowled. Okay, so I noticed something curious. There's a triplet. Both are triplets here. And I have one of those is a bit not like the other two. So we have two that are alike and one that's different. And it's sort of a mirror image in a way. We have the Saul's dedicated, Saul's the possessive is the first sort of odd one out of that triplet. And the last one is the verb prowled is sort of the odd one compared to still fermented, still heaved. Almost a triangular shape here. Juxtapose those two sort of triangular shapes. What we see sort of emerging is an image. What is that image? It's the Star of David, the iconic symbol of the Hebrew nation. Legend has it that the shape of David's shield looked like that. Sort of that iconic star, the Star of David. All right, so let's continue, all right? Well, then I begin to see that this continues to happen. We get the Lord's anointed, but David's deeply rooted faith chose to see the Lord's anointed, not the royal discontent, the turbulent hunter of his life. Two pairs here again, two sort of nouns describing the Lord's anointed. And then hill and cave and longish ye and Gedi nights. Two sort of place references, hill and cave. And then that reference to time, longish ye and Gedi nights. So again, the same sort of pattern reemerges, a sort of mirror image of a triplet and another triplet where one is different than the other two. Two that are alike, one is different. Now, look at how Saul's described. Grievous, great. There's alliteration there. Flawed instrument. Needed music, loved courage. Same sort of predicate structure. ED on the ending of the verb for both of these. Needed music, loved courage, monumental anger. Majesty, pride, quick remorse. We have three times where again you have two that are alike, one that is different. And so we see this pattern again and again and again throughout the poem. We see it in terms of the participants. You have David and Saul and the Lord, and each of them has their sort of counterpart. David has his partner, Abishai. Saul has his main guard, Abner, and the Lord has his prophet, Samuel. You still have those items in 3. Now, this is where it begins to get really interesting. Because as I notice when I read this, let me smite him, I pray thee, the Lord himself will strike. And they left, taking the mighty spear, whose sharp whistle has shaved the air before it, just missing him as he sat composing psalms. Now, notice what's happening here. They left, taking. Past tense, left, verb ing, taking. Whose sharp whistle had shaved, past tense, just missing, verb ing. As he sat, past tense, verb ing. 3 times, 3 levels, one after the other, in this really complex clause construction. What stands out then? In all that complexity, with all these things in 3s, what stands out? The simplest instance of parataxis, the cruise of water, life. 2 nouns, side by side, the cruise of water, life, a pair. Unlike Gods Can Die, where pairs and parataxis was the background, here it is the foreground. Against this complexity where obviously you see 3 levels deep of the same kind of construction. Past tense, verb ing, past tense, verb ing, past tense, verb ing, all of that, and then the cruise of water, life. We see 2 pairs in this poem. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts. The first one we just saw, cruise of water, life. Pain and joy rippled in their hearts. Notice that simple sentence, pain and joy rippled in their hearts. And then on either side of it, again, real complex clause construction. Darting nimbly as they climbed, held their breath, checked the drift of stars, the needling angle of the wind as it shifted across gullies, pushing patches of mist up the slopes. Again, all that complex clause. And in fact, if we take a look at it, we can see there's again a kind of pattern there where we have darting, pushing, 2 ends, and then we have 2 that are like, the verbs held and checked. And before pushing, we have the 2 nouns, the drift of the stars, the needling angle of the wind. We have 2 noun phrases, pushing. Darting, 2 verbs, held, checked. Again, we have sort of a kind of symmetry here, again involving things in 3s where 2 are alike and 1 is different. That is the sort of mobilizing the habitual patterns of language choice, taking the way that you use language. It's normal language, but using it with a kind of consistency and intensity, a non-habitual consistency. Likewise, after pain and joy rippled in their hearts. Again, you notice the complexity, kept from discovery, certain death by the Lord, whose other hand dispensed the dew of sleep on Saul's army. They gained the distant high space of a neighboring hill where sad David called down to Abner, Saul's bravest of the brave. That whole thing is a sentence. So you have all this complexity before, and then you have simple pain and joy rippled in their hearts. And then all this complexity after. There's an interesting thing here. Kept from discovery, certain death, a pair. Called down to Abner, Saul's bravest of the brave. Now, again, you have sort of a kind of patterning that takes place here. kept from discovery certain death by the Lord. Then the main clause, they gained the distant. And then where sad David called down to Abner, Saul's bravest of the brave. Notice those two sort of pairs come at the beginning, at the end of that sentence. Again, a kind of symmetry, a kind of mirror image. So what stands out here? And the cruse of water, life. Now notice what follows. Leaving the camp, the chance to cure so simply their exile and uncertain bitter south, they walked between trenches of enemies divinely tranquilized. What comes after pain and joy, rippled in their hearts? Kept from discovery certain death by the Lord, whose other hand dispensed the dew of sleep on Saul's army. They gained the distant and on. The same thing is being described after the cruse of water, life, and then in other words, after pain and joy rippled in their hearts, the same thing is repeated. That they were protected as they left the camp because the soldiers were divinely tranquilized, because the Lord dispensed the dew of sleep on Saul's army. Different ways of saying the same thing, both following cruse of water, life, pain and joy rippled in their hearts. You see, what is the poet doing? The poet is trying to get your attention. The poet is trying to get your attention. Cruse of water, life, pain and joy rippled in their hearts. What are the metaphors for us? What are the metaphors for me? And interestingly, because in Hebrew poetry and in the Psalms, there's a particular structure. It's called a chiastic structure. It almost looks like an X. That comes after the Greek letter. Sorry?
I'd like to ask the last slides. You mentioned they are emphasize the same things from
Yep.
27 to 30 and 39 to 41.
Right.
Do you mean they are repeating the same things?
Same content, but said in different words. In other words, when he uses "and the cruse of water, life," so then he says, leaving the camp, chance to cure so simply their exile in the uncertain bitter south, they walked between trenches of enemies divinely tranquilized. How could they leave the camp? Because the enemy was divinely tranquilized, put to sleep. What about pain and joy rippled in their hearts? Kept from discovery, certain death. Again, they are able to escape. How? By the Lord, whose other hand dispensed the dew of sleep on Saul's army. They gained the distant, and goes on. They escaped. So the point is that after both of these pairs, these foregrounded pairs, the cruse of water, life, pain and joy, basically the poet is repeating the same content, but just in other words. Okay? Can I come back to this part, the chiastic structure? It's because this is a poem about David. And so it's interesting that the poet uses a kind of structure which would be found in the Psalms. It's a chiastic structure. It comes from the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. Kept from discovery, certain death. You are worthy to die. You're not kept. That, again, that sort of cross-reference here. Kept, certain death to die. You see it in the Psalms. Again, this sort of chiastic structure. In one of the Psalms, the heavens declare the glory of God. When do you see the heavens? When do you see the stars? At night, right? When do you see the blue sky? The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Daytime. And then notice the next reference in the next verse is day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. The heavens is to night as the skies are to day. Well, that structure is that mirroring of structures That's what we see very often in the Psalms. But Edwin Tumbu is taking it and employing it in this poem about David. So what were the metaphors for us? For me, what I took away from this, what I understood, life, pain and joy. Yes, in life, there is pain and joy. But the whole point of the poem was basically that David was protected. He snuck into the camp, and as we just saw repeated, God made that army fall asleep. So he was able to escape. He was able to get away. He was protected. What was the image that we said we saw, that I was saying I saw in looking at the analysis here, in terms of looking at these triplets and the sort of juxtaposition of this sort of a very kind of mirror image where you had two that were alike and one was different? We said it's the iconic, it was the legendary shape of David's shield. What is a shield? Shield is protection. You see, the poem is a kind of blessing. In this life, yes, you have pain and you have joy. You are protected. You are protected. God protects you. That was to me, that was what this poem was about. This is an extended metaphor. Yes, the whole point of it was a blessing. That was the idea. That was the point that I took away from what this poem was about. That's how I interpreted, based on what I observed in terms of the structures that appeared there in the text. That's why when I asked, because I was very interested after analyzing it like this, and asked Edwin if that was what his meaning was. And that was when he said to me, I said to him, did I capture it? Did I get it? And remember his reply, I think I've told you before, some of it. Some of it. So there's probably more here than I see, than I've talked to you about. That is the idea of the poem, though, the metaphor. It's for you to discover what is the picture that the poet is painting, and how do you interpret it? How do you understand it? What is that meaning that you take away? Now, what I take away is that it was a blessing. That was my hypothesis, and I've tried to support my hypothesis with evidence from what I observed in the text itself. Notice how it ends, heard and spoke. Again, two that are alike, both relating to the exchange of language, and then departed. What you do have to realize here is that the poet's use of language is very deliberate, very much by design. And when you read it, you don't sense that, you don't feel that. You don't feel, oh, it's so contrived. No. You read it, you hear it. And when I read it the first time, I thought this is just like a Bible story said in sort of a more poetic way. But it was way more than just a Bible story repeated. There was a meaning to it. There was an intention to it. Well, I think that I will wait then to go on with this one, a poet reading. Honestly, a poet reading is my favorite poem. of Edwin Tumbu's. It is the most to identify and see within this particular poem. It is really art. So I hope you come back in 10 minutes, and it's 10 to 9 now. Come back in 10 minutes and let me go through this poem with you, okay? So let's take a break now.
Dr. Webster,
Yes,
can I ask a very short question?
sure.
You mentioned metaphor a lot when analyzing the poems, including like extended metaphor. So extended metaphor is the connotation of the poem, basically.
Yes, I think all of it sort of contributes to this idea. I mean, the poem itself, all the structures that are part of it, all are contributing to a meaning. There is a theme, and that theme is being represented. And in many ways, we can see through the use of grammatical structures, all of them contributing to what that poem is about. That poem is a metaphor. There is a deeper meaning. To say that that poem has a deeper meaning is to say that it has a quality of projecting, picture making.
Also,
It projects a picture.
So we also mentioned grammatical metaphor. So
Grammatical metaphor we've mentioned, and we've talked about metaphor before, in the sense that you have lexical metaphors. Remember my example, Tim is a rock, all right?
So lexical metaphor is like A is like B. Then, right, A is
Not
like
a, that's a simile. When you use like, that's a simile, but metaphors are, it's not, you're saying, you're comparing two things that are completely unalike, all right, completely dissimilar. When we talk about grammatical metaphor, what we're saying is, instead of taking on the qualities of some lexical word, is taking on the qualities of a grammatical category. So as I explained a moment ago before about grammatical metaphor, turning verbs into nouns, then they take on that quality of nounness. And in so doing, they become a grammatical metaphor. So metaphor, you have to understand, that's why Halliday likes to use the word de-automatization. It's taking what you would think to be sort of the default way of understanding it, the default way of expressing it, and somehow expressing it in another way. In order to be able to capture a particular meaning that you otherwise would not get on it through the literal meaning. All right. Now, when we talk about a poem, we're saying that it is an extended metaphor. The whole poem, the whole text itself, the text itself becomes a metaphor. And in this case, the example I just was giving, Tumbu's David, I was taking that metaphor as being a blessing, protection, like that. Okay?
Okay, thank you. So basically, extended metaphor is about the main idea, the connotation people take from that literature. And
Yeah, in other words, think of it like this, so that when you talk about a lexical metaphor, it's at the level of words, the lexicon. When you talk about grammatical metaphor, it's the grammar, right? So lexical metaphor, Tim is a rock. He has quality of rockness, the quality of that word. If you talk about reminder instead of reminding, then you took on, remind has the qualities of nounness, all right? If you talk about an extended metaphor, by using those sort of patterns and repatterning of those patterns, the foregrounding, you are getting across a particular meaning, a representation. And that's why I remember the psychiatrist from University of Sydney, the emeritus professor Mears. He talks about there being a kind of picture making potential of metaphors.
So the noun is an example of grammatical metaphor, or is basically is what grammatical metaphor is?
Metaphor is really anything which is sort of another sort of, you could call it another kind of meaning, another meaning that is being represented. It is sort of an alternative representation, an alternative meaning. So, and when we talk about, we've talked about the three: lexical, grammatical, and extended.
So nominalization is a grammatical metaphor.
If we are turning a verb into a noun, yes, the kind of, in that case, in that sense, where what we're doing is we're giving it the qualities of nounness, and by doing so, what are we doing? We're giving it that, by turning it into a noun, you make it into something that is fixed. It is something that is stable. It is something that is concrete. It's there. It has substance. All right. So you do give it an alternative meaning. You give it another picture, just by virtue of its grammatical, the nature of that grammatical category. What does a noun represent? What does a verb represent? What we're saying is they have a meaning. There's a grammatical meaning. And that meaning is what is you are using metaphorically.
Okay, I got it. Thank you for
Okay.
your time. Sorry to borrow your.
No. That's, what time are we now? Almost time.
See you soon.
Okay. Okay, let's continue. And as I said, I think of all the poems that I've analyzed of Edwin Tumbu's, this is the one that has struck me the most. And let's see what you think after hearing it and thinking about it. Okay, so let's listen to him read the poem.
A poet reading. 1. She is sunlight, standing by the pool, in a garden we lace with flowers and songs, as we walked into ourselves, enshrined within a tactile moment, with no beginning, with no end, a brow lifted gently by rising lotuses receives the sky's deep reverence. As her eyes watch 7 golden koi swim serenely into provinces of silence. Then, on the left side, where the heart resides, a hand lifts reluctantly, as if compelled by lingering strands of bitter ancient winds, now sadly come together, taking her in ways that only harsh things can. There is always darkness to elide, after which she is again sunlight waiting to be poems. 2. She is someone we all know, especially those whose names are written in water, who scour big and small infinities, who are at times blessed by paths that absolve the failure of their lines, when, pilgriming, they find a star's immaculate art that returns us to this image, tricing yet again. Then lexicon and grammar and naming stir, bringing metaphor, metonymy, synapsis, plus assorted relatives to achieve a feverish making. That is never done, for our words don't take in all. A cup always slips, shatters into lamentations at imagination's door. The perfect poem is future tense. Meanwhile, neat incompletion must suffice. Life goes on. Meditate on words for modern times. Life to this surge, this minute and the next, curving towards us to reveal poet on poet's calling. 3. Question. Is there difference if you've heard this one before or 7 other people read the same poem, if ever it's the same? Which do you, he, she and I hear or want? We anticipate having written a little ourselves. Some just wait, expectorant, but undecided, contemplating means to conjugate verbal icons. Others crouch beneath a great authority, namely, phonemes dipped in sounds to set against despair. Or from tough shards of ancestral history, especially post-colonial midnight happenings, marked by the magic of powerful afterbirth. Perhaps that nascent celebration in our heads, waiting for release, or buried because love, singing, died. Or a special CD, loading a line from Keats, knowing a drop of dew is but a world of dew. But then, semi-finally, that satisfactory equation, briefly great, formed as all-purpose burns into cool radiance, then soars up the throat of language, as she commands symbol, sound, and image to open and shut doors. Another poem does its work and then dissolves into earth, water, fire, air. 4. Impatient, the quiet starts to rustle and undo as rhyming fingers manage artifice and mood. Once more, she is sunlight by the pool, once more. Recalled, revised, recaptured for this gathering, she quivers, takes a space in several memories, is transmuted into many distances. As we listen to the one we come to find. The glass hall empties, awaits another coming. But she never leaves, our soul's certainty. See her as you will, as you can, as you travel, or sit still.
You notice at the end of the poem, and he puts his name, Edwin Tumbu, and then you have dates, August, September, December 1999, January 2000, August 2005, and you'll notice as he read it, he also changed it. Well, it's to get across a point. As he puts it, he says, a poem becomes more satisfactory to the poet with revision. The urge to revise is always there. It is a creative itch. In other words, that's the point he's saying. It's never complete, never perfect, always needs to be revised again and again and again. Of course, these continuing revisions contribute to the sense of what he refers to. He talks about neat incompletion, right? There is a motif, there is an idea here of sort of perpetual ongoing activity. How do you reinforce that grammatically? How do you get that across grammatically? Yes, you can say things like neat incompletion, or he'll otherwise say the perfect poem is future tense. How do you get it across grammatically? Well, notice something about his repeated use of ing verb forms. Now, remember what David Butt said? Mobilizing the habitual patterns of grammatical choice into a non habitual consistency. Taking the way you use language, creating a pattern. It stands out. It's not, by the repetition of it, by the intensity of that repetition, you are creating a kind of pattern. And here, by repeating the ing verbs, standing, taking, waiting, pilgriming, trysting, bringing, curving, contemplating, waiting, loading, knowing, making, what are you getting across? Well, what the poet is getting across is that it's a lot of ongoing, continuous activity. Then he uses also another grammatical device, a conjunction, as. What is the conjunction as signal? As we walked into ourselves, as her eyes watched seven golden koi. It is simultaneity. It is things that you are doing at the same time. As she commands, as it makes you, as rhyming fingers, as we listen, as you will, as you can, as you travel. In other words, there are several things going on at the same time. Ongoing activity, simultaneity. The poet is, by the repetition, by creating these patterns that are grammatical in nature, these are contributing to that extended metaphor that this poem is projecting. There's also a sense of incompleteness. It's not done. And he says it, in fact. I mean, he just actually says this outright. That is never done, for our words don't take in all. The perfect poem is future tense. Meanwhile, neat incompletion must suffice. Life goes on. Right, so he's getting across all of these sort of ideas in the poem. I'll come back to another feature that he uses, and that is the use of pronouns. Specifically, what we notice is the pronoun she, we, and you. These are repeated. I does occur once, but these are repeated. She is the most repeated, we, and you. When you see a pronoun, don't you ask the question, who is she? Sure, if it's you or it's we, you can answer that. But who is she? So isn't the poet really making you ask that question? Who is she? Well, what can we say about her? She is sunlight. She is again sunlight. She is sunlight. 3 times it's repeated. She is sunlight. And there are other things. Standing by the pool, her brow receives the skies. As her eyes watch, her hand lifts. She is someone we know. Do you notice something in the verbs here? Commands, quivers, stakes, lifts, watch. These verbs that are with tense, what tense is it? Present tense. Present tense. She is sunlight. You see, wherever she is the grammatical subject and there is a finite verb, it's always in the simple present tense. And what does that express? That expresses a sense of timelessness. It is neither future, it is not past, it is present, it is now. So we add one more, timelessness. And again, throughout the poem, you have this idea with no beginning and no end. There is always darkness to elide. There is no end to the craft that makes the art. That is never done, always slips. And then he makes up his own word, semi-finally, never. Timeless. Ongoing activity. Things happening at the same time, simultaneity, concurrence, all right? Incompleteness. Timelessness. Remember what Russell Mears said? The words of the poem are used in a symbolic way, having more than a single meaning. The effect of a few simple words combined in a particular way is to evoke a sense of reality that none of them possess alone. The nature of that reality is not precise, it is indefinite. Few simple words combined in a particular way. He makes it sound so simple. A few simple words combined in a particular way. This is the craft that makes the art. There's a line in the poem. I don't know if you noticed it when he was reading it. Another poem does its double work. It's double work? What does that mean? Double work. Is there another meaning there? And then dissolves into earth, water, fire, air. The four elements. Go back a minute. Gods can die. What was sort of the number that was sort of the pattern in that poem, Gods Can Die? Things in twos. What about David? Things in threes. This poem has how many parts? 4. How many elements are there here? Earth, water, fire, air. Is there something in this poem related to these 4 elements, earth, water, fire, air? Here's my hypothesis. A poet reading a poem in 4 parts. Each of these 4 parts highlights one of the 4 elements. And in this sequence, fire, water, air, earth. Okay, that is my hypothesis. Now, let me try to prove my hypothesis. First of all, I should begin by identifying the fact that this poem of Edwin Tumbu's is in a way modeled after T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. The 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot, 4 constituent poems, 4 poems, and each of those poems, one of them in this order: fire, water, air, earth. So is this poem of Edwin Tumbu's modeled after T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets? Did T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets basically provide the template that Edwin is drawing on for this poem? Remember, she is sunlight. Well, we notice that repeated 3 times, especially in the first part. She is sunlight. what is the association with sunlight? Fire. Pretty obvious. In other words, these sort of elements have certain associations. Sort of by tradition, sunlight is associated with fire. There's also an association with sort of a shape. The idea being that there's sort of a spiraling of energy. And what shape, what solid expresses this idea of spiraling energy up to sort of the fifth element? That's the idea. There is an association then between sunlight, fire, this idea of sort of spiraling energy, and that solid called a tetrahedron. Now, where is the basis for this? Okay, where is the basis for that? That it goes back to Plato. You know, the Greek philosopher Plato. He identified these sort of what are called Platonic solids, these shapes, with the elements. And specifically the tetrahedron, he identified with fire. Again, the idea of being sort of the idea of a spiraling of energy. All right, now, store that away. Keep that in mind. Take that first part. Part one. How many sentences, punctuated sentences, are there? There are 4. 4 punctuated sentences. Now, how many sides does a tetrahedron have? You can see on the screen 4. Okay. Let's go a step further. Notice that there are a number of words that have sort of traditional associations with these elements. Sunlight, I mentioned, fire. Pool, water. Garden, earth. Songs, air. Now, I didn't make these up. These are sort of traditional associations out of the culture, right, that have been developed that have an association with the elements. Feeling, tactile, is earth. The sky is air. Eyes, looking, fire. Swimming, water. Some of these are pretty obvious. Heart, water. Lingering strands of bitter ancient wind, air. Darkness, earth. Sunlight, fire. Okay, if I look through this then and I look at these particular associations that stand out here, I notice that there are sort of 3 repetitions of this fire, water, earth, air. Now, is there something sort of being developed here? Fire, water, earth, air. Earth, air, fire, water. Water, air, earth, fire. You have a tetrahedron. In other words, not unlike David, where there was sort of this image of the Star of David, which legend had was the shield, the shape of his shield, David's shield. He was a warrior. And here we have another sort of visual image that is created by the language, by the ways in which the writer, the poet, is arranging the combination of words. The first part, a tetrahedron, 4 sentences, 4 sides, fire. So what are the Platonic solids? You see them pictured here, all right? Fire, just looked at the tetrahedron. Air, earth is a cube, water. Okay, now let's take a look. In 3 of these 4 stanzas, the number of sentences equals the number of faces of a Platonic solid corresponding to an element. In other words, stanza 1, 4 sentences, 4-faced tetrahedron, fire. Skip stanza 2 for a moment. Stanza 3, 8 sentences, the 8-faced octahedron, air. Stanza 4, 6 sentences, 6-faced cube, earth. There's only one stanza that doesn't fit. It is the exception. But remember, the perfect poem is future tense. In other words, the poet is creating patterns based on these associations, and creating sort of an extended metaphor, which in the case of, for example, stanza 2, there is an exception. It breaks down, but that is the point of the poem. That is the theme of the poem. That a poem is never done. It always continues to need to be revised. It never is finished. That is the whole point. So what the poet does is create this sort of really lovely patterning in language that creates this imagery, but is incomplete. It is in the incompleteness that the poet is making his point. I want you to notice something else, though. And this goes back to T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. Again, it was in the same order: fire, water, air, earth. His was 4 constituent poems in the 4 quartets, and Edwin's is 1 poem with 4 parts. And we could say basically they're in the same sequence: fire, water, air, earth. But you know, there's something else there. Again, it just keeps going, all right? I mean, it's sort of a trajectory that keeps reaching out to yet another sort of association, another sort of metaphor emerging. This same sequence of elements is also known as a formula called the tetragrammaton. Now, the tetragrammaton is 4 letters: Y, H, W, H. And what does it spell? The Old Testament, biblical Hebrew, Yahweh, I am who I am, also refers to the process of creation. This idea, what is he spelling out here? In other words, the poem is like the incarnation of God. Now, is this what the poet is saying? Is this what it means? Who is she? Who is she? Our reading of who she is, like our reading of the poem, is never done. We never really know for sure. It extends So we've seen it so far recursively, multiple trajectories, as far as our knowledge of conceivable associations will allow. See her, remember what is the ending of the poem? See her as you will, as you can. You may not see it. You may not see what the poet meant, but you have to discover what the poet meant. And it is in the act of discovering the meaning and interpreting the meaning that the poem lives. There is really a metaphor within a metaphor. We've seen it. See her as you will, as you can, as you travel or sit still. The poet's technique is what releases the poem. This is what Edwin says, the poem into a form of immortality. I think I told you the story, right? When I left Singapore and I asked Edwin to come and I asked him to read a poem to my class. I was leaving Singapore to come to Hong Kong, and it was my last lecture. I taught a course, sociolinguistics. Edwin had written a poem, Language is Power. I asked him to come to the class. It was a large class, over 200 students, and read the poem. And he agreed to do so. He was the head of the department. He was the dean of the faculty. So I went to his office to escort him to the lecture theater to go and read the poem. As we're walking along, and I said to him, Professor Tambu, if you don't mind, after you finish reading the poem, could you explain the poem? Could you let the students know what it's about? He looked at me very sternly, very sternly. He said to me, you never ask the poet to interpret his own poem. I felt, I'm embarrassed, yes. Honestly, I didn't see why. I thought that it was quite all right to ask him to explain the poem. But now, after reading a poet reading, I understand. What was the point he was making? The poem means what it means to you, the reader. If the poet says this is what the poem means, then that's it. It can mean nothing else. It cannot mean, oh, I can't say, the poet interprets the poem, then I say, oh, no, the poem means this. No, cannot. The poem, but that means, though, that every time that poem is read, it will be understood. It'll be interpreted, and it will depend on what the person knows, and it'll depend on their background, their culture, and all their influences, and depend on their knowledge of the language and what they search for and discover. And that poem will keep on meaning. It'll keep on living. It will have a form of immortality because it never stops meaning. There's a beauty in that. I'm going to end with the last poem. The last poem is Uncle Never Knew. Edwin Tambu, you can see his name, Indian name. His father was Indian. His mother was Chinese. So he was mixed Chinese and Indian. And on his mother's side, one of his uncles came from China, was brought from China specifically by the family to help with the family business in Singapore. And this uncle was very reluctant. He didn't want to be in business. He didn't want that. He wanted to be back in China. And he was, the poem is really Edwin talking about his uncle, and he had quite a close relationship with his uncle. His uncle would be sort of living away from the hustle and bustle of the city, and Edwin would go out to spend time with him, talk with him, hear from him, and Edwin was hearing all these stories about China. Edwin wrote this poem, Uncle Never Knew. When Edwin gave it to me, he said, "You'll notice that there are none of the Western influences in this poem. So don't look for them." Now, I don't have a recording of it, so I'm going to have to read it, and you'll have to pardon me if my reading of the Singaporean names is not sufficiently Singaporean, all right? Uncle Never Knew. He lived, if you could call it that, 2 streets off Boat Quay North, tranquil as leaves left in a teacup, always alone but never lonely. The daily bustle of barge and coolie, ferrying rubber and rice and spice, all energy and profit for Tokays and Guthries, slipped past without ripple or sound or promise. No enterprising cleverness to make his brothers happy, as nothing drew him to our hot meridian. Line 9. Often after rain he would watch the day dry out, but if a few fine drops caught the sun and glittered against that thinning blue strip of northern sky, he was back in Swatow, at his table, preparing ink and brush, fingering his father's piece of jade, intoning Libo, Dufu, and reading Mao. Sipped tea, fed his carps while waiting for his friends. I've been asked previously, before I continue, where is Swatow? And in Singapore, Shantou is referred to as Swatow. So that gives you some idea. That's where his uncle was from. It was always interesting. Edwin visited Hong Kong a number of times. I invited him to City U, the School of Creative Media invited him. So he visited Hong Kong a number of times. His dream, which he never got to realize, was always to visit where his uncle was from. Never got there. And yet that was always something that always he would mention. I wish I could go to Shantou. Continue. Part 2. Great houses are history, clan, essential unity, belief. A way of life which brooks no breaking of fidelity. Rooted comforts reaffirm. Nothing is extinguished. Memory is full, and he was ensconced, secure. For a few, it's the only pulse. Many need this bedrock, this island, so little that Cheng Ho barely noticed. Line 22. Post-astral uncle stroked his undernourished beard, spoke to clouds, not people. The moon climbed roofs as he waited for glowworms to signify the darkening bamboos. Communing with self, he was his favorite neighbor. He could not hear migrant hearts change rivers from big to a small, smelly one, or feel dreams gather along Carpenter Street, then roll down Telok Ayer up Ang Siang Hill to answer temple bells. The world was hard language, felt daily as heart and will drop into soft releasing opium, working up hungry lungs as shadows flickered on the wall. He never knew our age in full, had no transplanted way to name its joys, its follies. True exile, he denied our home till life do us part in 51, leaving companions Marx, Engels, Mao, Lu Xun, the Li Sao, Tao Qian. When I am Bayou River, I feel Uncle watching me. I hear much from inside his spirit, his affirmations. Old country stories resurface, tell their tale. That house I've never seen tries to sketch itself. He lived, if you could call it that, 2 streets off Boat Key North. Tranquil as leaves left in a teacup, always alone but never lonely. The daily bustle of barge and coolie ferrying rubber and rice and spice, all energy and profit for Tokays and Guthries, slip past without ripple or sound or promise. This opposition of Uncle's very tranquil, solitary existence and the daily bustle, life around him. There's a poem written by Tao Qian. It's the title of the poem is Drinking Wine. There's a similar opposition that's found in that poem in those first 2 lines of Drinking Wine. I built my house in this world of men, but there is no noise of carriages and horses. Zhang Longxi, Professor Zhang Longxi, from the department, he used to be in this department. He's now in the Department of Chinese and History. He says this: the first 2 lines of this poem set up a structural and thematic opposition between the poet's private world and the world of men, with its noise of carriages and horses, an opposition that reappears time and again in Tao Qian's poetry. The point seems to me to be that what Edwin is using, as he said, don't look for Western influences. Instead, he's drawing here on influences like from Tao Qian's poetry, that the similar opposition of his uncle, and that solitary existence compared to the noise of hustle and bustle of what was going on around him in the world of men. Uncle was the true exile. And he as I said, he resisted attempts to bring him into the family business. As Edwin says in the poem, no enterprising cleverness to make his brothers happy, as nothing drew him to our hot meridian. He longed for the life he previously knew back in Swatow before he had been brought by the family to help with the business. He didn't want to. And so again, I'm quoting from Professor Zhang Longxi, the poet's description of Edwin's description of his uncle again recalls descriptions of Tao Qian. There was a certain stubbornness and a great deal of courage in Tao Qian that made him a solitary traveler on the path he chose. Continuing, you'll notice that there are references to the poetry of Du Fu, and again, pardon my pronunciation. And Du Fu is supposed to be representative of the Confucianist way. And then there's also the mention of Li Bo, one of the 8 immortals of the wine cup, a very Taoist influence. And so intoning Li Bo, Du Fu, so representing sort of these two views, one Confucianist, one Taoist. And then you again had sort of a comparison here between, on the one hand, Marx, Engels, and Mao, and revolution, and tradition, Lu Xun, the Li Sao, Tao Qian, the foundations of China's cultural heritage. So again, you do notice something of a symmetry here. You do notice something of a balance that is being sought, perhaps. Confucianist, Taoist, revolution, tradition. Now, there's an interesting part to this poem. I hope I'm going to have time to finish it, all right, because I'd be disappointed not to be able to. Astral. There's a reference here, post-astral uncle, in line 22. What's astral mean? Well, what astral means is something like an out-of-the-body experience, okay? More accurately here, the reference astral is more like when uncle was in his head back in China. This idea that when he was back in Swatow, in his thinking, in his mind, that was his astral, out-of-the-body experience. So you have that part that he's back in Swatow, that astral experience. Post-astral implies that would be afterwards, right? Now, look at what happens here. The first 11 lines of the poem describe pre-astral uncle, before he's sort of in his head back in China. Look at the first 11 lines. Often after the rain, he would watch the day dry out, but if a few fine drops caught the sun, glittered against this thinning blue strip of northern sky, what would happen? 12, he was back in Swatow. And that's his astral experience. So lines 1 through 11, his pre-astral experience. And then lines 12 through 21, his astral-like back in Swatow experience. That extends from lines 12 through 21. He was back in Swatow at his table, and it continues up to line 21. Line 22, post-astral uncle. So we're beginning to see the poem divide, not by parts 1 and 2, but instead by something else. 11 lines later, line 22, he has become post-astral uncle, and you can see that here, line 22 through line 31. Then a curious thing happens in line 32. Now, one thing, look at lines 22 through 31. What's the tense there? Look at line 31. The world was, past tense. Past tense, stroked his undernourished beard, spoke to clouds, all past tense. In line 32, and will drop into soft releasing opium, working up hungry lungs as shadows flickered on the wall. And he switches in line 32, drop, not dropped, drop, present tense. The tense shifts. So the first 11 lines, 1 through 11, pre-astral uncle. Uncle's astral-like back in Swatow experience, lines 12 through 21. The next 11 lines later, line 22, post-astral uncle. So 11 keeps popping up here. Again, 11 lines later, in line 32, the tense shifts from past tense, present tense. The verb, finite verb, drop. As heart and will drop into soft releasing opium, working up hungry lungs. So the poem itself divides into these parts, a pre-astral uncle, lines 1 through 11. 11 lines later, after we have astral uncle, 12 through 21. 11 lines later, post-astral uncle. 11 lines later, the restoration and return. Numbers figure strongly in Edwin Tumbu's poetry. But it does raise the question, line 42 through 51. Is there a part that's missing here? Remember, when did Uncle leave? Not till death do us part, till life do us part. When Uncle returned to China, it was in 1951. Till life do us part. 51. What happened then in lines 42 through 51? Now, this number 11 keeps popping up. He never knew our age in full, had no transplanted way. 11 words. If we count, 11, 11, 11, 11. So that number 11 keeps popping up. Is there a significance to the number 11? Okay, so if we go to the I Ching and we look up the hexagram 11, what does it represent? Peace, tranquility, balance between the earth above and heaven below. For the poet's uncle, it was not death that parted them, but life, till life do us part in 51. Before his return, it was open to question whether he lived. Remember, he lived, if you could call it that, was what Edwin wrote. But life is recovered as uncle returns to his origin. If you look up the I Ching and you look up the lines from hexagram 11, there's a line there not regarding one's companions. And now notice in that line, till life do us part in 51, leaving companions. Again, he's drawing on these influences from the I Ching, from Tao Qian. You can see the influence of yin and yang, the philosophy and so forth, represented in the way in which he also has this kind of pattern of balance, repetition. I don't have time to go through all of these examples that show ink and brush, Libo, Dufu, sip tea, fed his carps. Yin representing emptiness and nothingness, yang, movement and energy. I want us to close with this part here. At the end of the poem is these 4 lines. When I am by you, river, I feel uncle watching me. I hear much from inside his spirit, his affirmations. I, the repeated grammatical subject, I feel, I am, I hear. Uncle's presence is sensed, his affirmations are heard, but on a very spiritual plane, not physical. He's remembering his uncle. The idea of the Tao and return to origins. I mean, that is basically the idea that he's representing here, this idea of the river. But the last part here, the old country stories resurface, tell their tale. That house I've never seen that tries to sketch itself. The verbal, tell their tale. So the visual tries to sketch itself. There's a creative energy that's at work here. So when did Uncle return to Swatow? In 51. Uncle never knew. It ends in line 41. And it ends with this, that house I've never seen tries to sketch itself. That's Edwin speaking. That house I've never seen tries to sketch itself. The poet has never seen what Uncle was talking about. The sketch, the idea, it's unfinished. It's not complete. It tries to sketch itself. The poem, by the poet's own admission, then, is incomplete. It never really captures that way of life that his uncle was telling him about, that house back in Swatow. The lines that have been left unwritten. Lines that perhaps the poet would have been able to tell, would have been able to see if he had had the opportunity. But as he says, neat incompletion must suffice. Life goes on. I recently heard from Edwin Tumbu, and unfortunately his health is not very good, and he's disappointing in the sense that he never really did get to live out that wish of his. And those lines must remain unwritten. Well, I hope that what you've seen me go through with these poems is what I've been trying to show you is that there is a deeper meaning. There's a deeper meaning that's there to be discovered. It's in the language, yes. It's also in other aspects of the culture, our knowledge of the literature, all these things that the poet brings into the poem. So see her as you will, as you can. But in reading the poem, you try to discover what that meaning is. You discover what that deeper meaning is. And with what we've been doing and what I believe we've been able to do with the approach that we've been taking to language is really, indeed, discovering what the resources are that are behind the craft that makes the art. Okay, that's, we've gone a bit over time, 9:53. Next week, I'll be reviewing with you in preparation for your test in week 8. Please remember that you also have some assignments that are due this week and also then in week 8. Okay, so remember all that, and I'll say good night and go read some poetry. Okay, good night.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Oh, Professor?
Yes?
Yeah, sorry. Sorry for the stopping you. Sorry for the
No,
interruption.
no, it's fine.
I wanted to ask you, will you be uploading the official answers for the first assignment, the answers for the analysis part?
Yes, you have the analysis already.
I mean, you gave the answers to us. You showed it to us in the start of the lesson, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
I was wondering if you will be posting. Are those on the slides? I'm not so sure. Are those on the slides? Have
Yeah,
you printed
well,
the
what I've
answers?
shown you is it's on the slides. If you want, I can put on the, if it would help, I can put up the document file. Would that help?
Yeah, that would be helpful. That would be very helpful.
Sure, sure.
Because I couldn't find them on my slides. Maybe I mixed
It's
up my
on the
slides.
slides, yeah, and
Okay,
it's
okay.
there. But I can also put it up in one, so you don't have to be looking at separate slides to.
That would be very helpful. That would be very helpful. Yeah, thank
Okay,
you so much.
I'll put it in the folder for homework along with the other files. Okay.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay. Good night,
Have a nice
everybody.